Okay. You always want to make sure that you are writing that few sentences to the context of the test. So make sure that you're more than welcome to use the examples in the PowerPoints as outlines for yourself. I have zero problem with that. You just have to make sure you're changing the context of it based on the analysis that you're conducting. Okay. So this is all for one sample t-test. I'll tell you right now, as part of completing your SPSS assignment for the t-test, you are going to need to include screenshots of this one sample statistics table as well as this one sample test table. You do not need to include one sample effect sizes. However, if you just do a big screenshot, I'm not going to knock you down for incorporating it, but you do need to make sure that both of these tables, the one sample statistics and one sample test, is that it is present in your screenshot. All right, so that's for conducting a one sample t-test. We are now going to make our way to conducting an independent samples t-test. So remember that independent samples is running an analysis between comparing the means between two different groups. So what that means is we need to have two different variables, right? One of the variables has to contain groups that we are comparing to one another. The other variable needs to contain the means or the averages that we're comparing about these groups. So that is to say, for independent samples t-test, your independent variable needs to either be a nominal or an ordinal variable. Okay, you have to have at least two groups that you're comparing. For your dependent variable, you have to have a scale variable, something that you can calculate an average for. Okay, so we're gonna make this a little bit easier because if you've been watching, that's wild. I was about to say that. If you've been following along with my particular flavor of sociology, I love focusing on race and ethnicity. So I'm going to choose race as my independent variable. If you right click on any of your variables in here, you get this little pop-up that can display additional information about the variable, or it can modify the way you view variables in here. However, I'm going to right click on this race variable because I need to choose from this race variable which two groups I'm going to compare. So t-test is only comparing two groups. I'm not comparing more than two. So I need to choose as the researcher which two groups I'm going to be comparing. I'm going to choose we'll just choose Asian as one group. And this is where we need to denote for ourselves. Okay, so our first group is Asian, and they are associated with the number 1 here. I'm going to compare them against our Chicanx groups. Chicanx group, that is group number 3. Okay, now the relevance of that is when you take your independent variable, you have to place it into this grouping variable box. Okay, so underneath grouping variable, that's where you place your independent variable, the variable that you are choosing groups out of. Notice that when I placed it into this area, it immediately popped up with 2 question marks. Those 2 question marks is SPSS's way of informing you that you have not yet selected which 2 groups you want to compare. When we select define groups, we're presented with another pop-up titled define groups. We're going to leave group 1 as 1. And the reason that we're doing that is because if you recall just a moment ago, I showed you that the Asian students are associated with that coded value of 1. So we're going to leave 1 because we're telling SPSS, all right, the Asians is our first group of students. For group 2, we're going to change this. Instead of comparing Asians against group 2, I'm going to compare them against group 3. That's the Chicanx group. So select continue. Notice here that those question marks are replaced with the groups that we've identified. Now we need to choose the test variable. This is where our dependent variable is going to be placed. I'm going to do one of these 3. You know what? I'm going to use units. Real quick, I'll just select this. Okay, that's what I would think. Give me just a moment to navigate over to my variable view. I want to make sure that, okay, I'm going to run a frequency analysis on this, oops. I'm going to run a frequency analysis on this units variable. And I'm going to do that. I should have also done it. I should do it also for the race variable because I told you should. So what I'm essentially telling SPSS is, all right, show me the details about these two variables. Close this out for a moment. We take a look at this. All right, we have 1,030 people who responded to this question about units, 1,062 who responded to this question about race. And looking at this frequency table for units, notice we have anywhere from 1 all the way up to 26. So because some of this data was collected without us collecting it ourselves, right? So we're going to make a little bit of inference here. And we're going to assume that this question about units was asking respondents, how many units are you taking this semester? Let's just run with that, okay? So we're going to come back down to compare means, back to our independent samples. We're going to place race back into this grouping variable. Make sure that Asians as group 1 are selected and Chicanx as group 3 are selected. And then we're going to place this units variable into this test variable box. Now, with this information entered, what we are saying, the hypothesis that we are working with is to say there is, well, our null hypothesis. There will not be a significant difference between Asian students and Chicanx students and the number of units that they are taking. That's our hypothesis, our null hypothesis, right? Our research hypothesis would then say there will be a significant difference between Asian students and Chicanx students and the number of units that they're taking, okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and run our independent samples t-test. We are presented with these three boxes: group statistics, independent samples test, and independent samples effect sizes. Similarly to what I mentioned with the one sample test, you're going to need to make sure your screenshot, your snipping tool captures this group statistics table and it captures this independent samples test table. So looking here, we have 108 respondents who identified themselves as Asian. Their average number of units is 13.77 with a standard deviation of 3.87. We have 318 Chicanx students with an average number of units of 12.28 and a standard deviation of 3.47. Looking at those two numbers, we see that there's a difference between them, right? There's a literal, calculable difference between the average number of units for Asian students and the average number of units for Chicanx students. I say that because I just want to emphasize here that recall the purpose of this t-test is to determine whether or not that difference is significant. Okay, is it a significant difference? Coming down to this independent samples test box or test table, this is where we are going to determine the outcome of this test. Notice that this first area here, these first two columns are highlighted under this title of Levine's test for equality of variances. We know how to calculate variance, right? We did that way back in module 3. So this test is essentially saying, can we assume that the variances of each of these groups are equal? Okay, based on this sig value underneath, the sig value underneath this Levine's test for equality of variances, we are going to determine whether we can assume equal variances or we cannot assume equal variances. And that's based off this number here, 0.163. Okay, this number will change based on the outcome of your analysis, but we need to pay attention first to this number to know whether we can assume equal variances or we cannot assume equal variances. So the way that this comparison goes within SPSS is that if this significance number underneath Levine's test for equality of variances is greater than 0.05, then we are going to only pay attention to the numbers in the top row of this independent samples t-test box, where we can assume equal variances. If, on the other hand, this significance number from Levine's test is less than 0.05, then we cannot assume equal variances, and we would then draw the information from the bottom row. Based on this outcome, if we compare 0.163 to 0.05, Our Levine's test significance of 0.163 is greater than 0.05, which means that we can assume equal variances, and we are going to continue taking the information from only the top row. We cannot draw from both the top and bottom row within the same analysis. Okay? So